Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Debbie Berkowitz. You were the chief of staff with OSHA and a senior policy advisor back under the Obama administration. So you know a lot about what's supposed to happen with workplace safety. And obviously, there's a lot more attention over the last few days to what's going on in East Palestine, Ohio, in the aftermath of this train explosion and the controlled release, as they're calling it. So first, I wanted to ask you, when you were with OSHA, um, were there times when we had these kinds of derailments with similar chemicals like vinyl chloride released into the air, or is this fairly unusual?
So I don't actually remember whether there were train explosions like this. But there are a couple of things I do know that OSHA has very strong regulations to protect workers from vinyl chloride exposure. Most of that exposure has to do with inhalation exposure and not from drinking water, which I know is also a concern. But these chemicals that were released into the air are really toxic. And to protect workers, we have at OSHA, we have very, very low levels of exposure that workers are allowed to be exposed to vinyl chloride because OSHA regulates it because it has the potential to cause cancer. And in fact, part of the OSHA regulations require companies to post a sign in work areas where workers would be exposed to vinyl chloride that says, this chemical may cause cancer. So you need to wear your respirator. You need to be protected. I mean, OSHA regulates vinyl chloride. Yeah, chemicals in the air in the workplace are measured in parts per million. So vinyl chloride, workers can only be exposed to 1 part per million. That's one. If there's a million parts of air, only 1 part of it could be vinyl chloride over an 8-hour workday. And requirements trigger in at 0.5 parts per million. But if workers were going to, instead of try to figure out whether they were exposed or not by whether they can smell vinyl chloride, they would already be in trouble because I don't think vinyl chloride, you can smell it till it's 3,000 parts per million. Wow. So the fact that people can smell chemicals in their houses is a little worrisome. And, it's really important that there be monitoring wherever people are in confined spaces, so that they make sure that these chemicals have dissipated. And I think, government figures have to be honest with people. I mean, in short term, it can cause, vinyl chloride can cause sort of respiratory distress, that if you get somebody out of the area very quickly, it should dissipate. But long term, it causes all sorts of health hazards. It attacks the central nervous system, if you have building up toxicity. So if you've been exposed to for a while. And the real thing is that in addition to looking, affecting the central nervous system, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the International Agency for Research on Cancer have classified vinyl chloride as a known human carcinogen. So for OSHA, when the standard that's required for employers is not only are there signs plastered all over the workplace to warn workers about the dangers of vinyl chloride, but also companies have to do medical monitoring to make sure that the small amounts that workers are exposed to are not causing long-term health effects. And, that's how dangerous it is.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you, obviously you're not a toxicologist, but this from the EPA update sparked my interest. This was yesterday they updated. I'll read it to you. They say, after the fire was extinguished on February 8th, the threat of vinyl chloride fire producing phosgene and hydrogen chloride no longer exists. So in English, it seems like they're saying after the fire is out, the threat of vinyl chloride producing, additional gases no longer exists. That sounds funky to me. I find that hard to believe, particularly since we're seeing reports of people having eyes burning, sore throat, coughing, not just in the immediate zone, but as far as 20, 25 miles away. Is the EPA statement there? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that vinyl chloride itself exposure can cause these kinds of health effects. So vinyl chloride gas inhalation can cause mild respiratory tract irritation, wheezing, and chemical bronchitis. And also central nervous system, like headaches, kind of damage. So, I can't tell you whether there's sulfostrene, which is also a toxic substance being released, but vinyl chloride itself is very dangerous. And it's, OSHA doesn't regulate a whole lot of chemicals just because it's a very small agency. But this was one of the first ones that OSHA, back when it was created in the 70s, really took a look at updating its protections because of how dangerous it was. And, I think, long-term damage can cause permanent liver injury and cancer. And, these things don't show up till later. So, and vinyl chloride can irritate the eyes, the mucous membranes, the respiratory tract. So, I think it's really important that there be a lot of monitoring going on, and that, this is dangerous. And I really feel for the people in this community and the surrounding community. They need to be protected, and the companies need to be stepping forward, as well as, the state government and the federal government.
And just from a common sense perspective, does it make sense that you would tell residents to go back home while testing is going on? I mean, isn't that kind of like, wouldn't you want to evacuate the immediate zone until not just one round of testing, but, potentially weeks of testing is done? The governor yesterday kind of was like, well, if it were me, I'd go home, but maybe do bottled water. It just seems like they're sending people back without testing being done.
These chemicals are really dangerous. And I would think, you want to be most protective than saying, oh, I think it's going to be okay. I think you need to do a lot more monitoring so the community can feel safe. That's how I'd approach it if this was a workplace hazard. I wouldn't send workers back in, oh, we think we cleared everything, and today at 8 o'clock, there wasn't a whole lot of vinyl chloride, but let's wait and see what happens at 5 o'clock or the next day before you start sending everybody back.
Right. And as far as the workplace regulations, obviously, President Obama actually pushed a regulation for trains that would make them update their brake system, because, we're talking Civil War era equipment here. That was repealed under President Trump. And in this case, we believe that's part of what happened here, where the brake system was inadequate. As far as I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of other trains carrying these chemicals in addition to other toxic chemicals that are not up to date and possibly could have further derailments.
Yeah, I think it was so short-sighted of the Trump administration, to repeal these regulations, which in the end may cost the rails company some money now, but look at the money they're spending, later, or actually now, for the disasters they've caused. And it's going to be a long time before this is all cleaned up. We used to have a saying when I was at OSHA that OSHA regulations don't kill jobs, they prevent jobs from killing workers. And it's the same with these kind of environmental regulations, is they don't kill jobs. They just prevent the environment from killing you so you can work. And I think it's very short-sighted. And I think this is the result of when you cut back. And, I think often companies, the first thing they cut is things about safety. And that's why you need government regulations.
And lastly, for the residents there who have been complaining about lack of transparency, they're not getting kind of straight answers. The governor's giving one answer, the EPA a different answer. What would be your recommendations for residents? Should they seek, independent water testing if they can afford it? what should they do? Because we know in Flint, there were issues with, some cherry picking of data, some manipulation of data. I don't want to, accuse the EPA of doing that, but there's been, not only in Flint, but elsewhere, some creative data gathering when it comes to water, air.
Well, I trust this administration to do the right thing in terms of federal EPA. But I also agree with the interview I heard with Erin Brockovich that people need answers and there should be a lot more monitoring. And people need to see that monitoring and understand the monitoring. And I know, if you haven't been in the field of toxicology and chemicals, it's all sort of, hard to wrap your brain around. But these are really dangerous chemicals. Right. Like super dangerous chemicals that if they were in the workplace, it would raise a million red flags as all of a sudden there was a leak. So I think people need a lot more information, and the government should spend money doing the testing. And I thought I heard the governor of Ohio this morning say if people don't want to return, that the company will pay for them to stay, elsewhere, still in a motel. And if that's true, they should, people may want to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Debbie Berkowitz. You were Chief of Staff with OSHA and a Senior Policy Advisor. You're now a fellow at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor over at Georgetown University. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me.